Hi everyone, my name is Lance Ackerman, Water Conservation Specialist with Colorado Springs Utilities. Thank you for joining me on this webinar today. Today we'll be discussing water-wise landscape design. This portion of the water-wise landscape design, we're going to really focus on the 7 principles approach for water-wise landscape design. That's where we're really transitioning a traditional landscape into a water-wise landscape design. In a future webinar, we're actually going to be discussing taking a step further and using very xeric plants and native plants to create a water-wise landscape design. But for this webinar, we're going to focus on the 7 principles. And those 7 principles are to have a plan, evaluate and improve the soil, create practical turf areas, select plants adapted to our climate, water efficiently, use mulch, and finally maintain with good horticultural practices. So let's go ahead and get started. So what is a water-wise landscape? So this is a little bit of a review from our previous webinar on water-wise landscaping for beginners, but it's critically important that we understand what a water-wise landscape is. This picture on the right-hand side is a picture of a yard that somebody has removed all of the vegetation. This is not a water-wise landscape. When you remove all that vegetation and install 100% rock, that landscape becomes unusable, and over time it's going to be very difficult to maintain and manage from a weed standpoint. Also, when you remove all that vegetation and add all this rock, it does not add any value to your property. Another example that is not a water-wise landscape is this example here, which is just too much grass. This is what we call kind of a fence-to-fence Kentucky bluegrass approach. And this was really prominent in the 1990s and early 2000s of a landscape. So what the problem with this landscape is it's really water intensive, can be expensive to maintain over time. So what we'd recommend is to reduce that lawn size and create a practical turf area for this to become a water-wise landscape. So what is a water-wise landscape? It's a balanced approach. So you're really taking that landscape and dividing it up into thirds, a third of that being a high water intensive or high water use area. The other third is plant beds with low to moderate water usage. And then finally, that final third is of that lawn area or your landscape area receives no water. So those can be the patios, retaining walls, hardscapes, areas for sheds, things like that that are not going to be receiving any water. So that's really a kind of an initial step to take for a water-wise landscape, is to think of it in thirds. So this image here is a water-wise landscape due to the fact that this landscape has been divided up, and he's created some planting beds with some retaining walls. He's got plants that are being irrigated with drip irrigation. This turf area, this lawn area, is an alternative turf, so that's a buffalo grass lawn. So that's a low water usage grass species, and this is in the front yard, so that grass is not receiving much traffic. Another example of a water-wise landscape is, you can see here they've taken that third approach where they've got themselves a nice lawn area. It's Kentucky bluegrass. It's in the back lawn. Over here on the right-hand side of the picture, you can see they've got a patio. So they've started to develop some of these spaces that aren't going to be receiving any water. And they also have some of these nice plants, very simple ornamental grasses and plants that are repeated throughout this landscape. You can see the same plants are kind of repeated on the perimeter of that grass area. And finally, in the back there, they've put up a shed or a detached garage for more functionality for this landscape. Another example of a water-wise landscape here is, you can see again they've used some retaining walls to create these plant beds. We've got some plants that are in this plant bed that are being irrigated by drip irrigation. They all have the same water requirements, so from an irrigation or a sprinkler standpoint, that makes it very easy to schedule that irrigation system. And again, we have another alternative grass type here, which is a blue grama, and it looks like this may be on the side of the house where it's not really being used very much, but this could be potentially be used as an erosion control or a slope to manage the slope on the side of the house. Another very simple approach to water-wise landscape here is they've decided to eliminate that turf grass or that lawn area that's traditionally found on the left-hand side or on the sides of the driveway. Those areas don't receive, they're not used very frequently for that turf grass to be there. So they've eliminated that turf grass and again installed a very simple approach with some ornamental grasses and some simple shrubs, a few evergreen trees, a dry stream bed, and again applied some mulch. And this is also being irrigated by a drip irrigation. So just to reiterate, a water-wise landscape is not 100% rock. This landscape can be problematic. Look at this poor dog in this landscape. I feel terrible for him. He's looking like he's needing some water. This landscape is not usable, and over time, the weed management in this landscape is going to become troublesome. So just to reiterate, 100% rock is not the target for a water-wise landscape. So the very first principle is to have a plan. Having a plan is the most critical step to designing your landscape. You need to have a plan and stick to that plan. Designing a landscape and starting to get started on your landscape is an exciting time, and it can lead to some poor decisions just through that excitement. So just caution you to have that plan and stick to the plan. Some of the things that you need to have on your plan initially is this, what we call a site analysis. And that's really where you're starting to understand your exposures. So you can see in this image here, they've determined that this area of the lawn receives significant afternoon heat. Over here, this perhaps is the north side of the house. So, you know, there's got full shade over here. They're also starting to note some other things of they might need a side path here to traverse around the house to get to the gate. It looks like they have some maybe some northwesterly wind coming from this portion of the property, so they would like to have some sort of wind screen. They started to indicate some slope areas, a swale, and where their downspouts are going to be leading to, so they can direct water away from the house. They've indicated where they have some views, so maybe this is the west view of the house, and maybe they got a really nice view of Pikes Peak or something else that they want to make sure that they keep in mind. That way they're not blocking that view with plants as they become mature. So those are some of the things that you want to start to just really understand about your site and your property. So again, the views, you want to make sure you protect those views, whether they're the good, the bad, or the ugly. So if it's a good view, you want to make sure you preserve that view. Don't put any plants there that are going to block that view. Don't put any structures. Potentially it might be a pergola or something, but just keep that in mind that you don't want to block that view. Or if it's a bad or an ugly view, maybe you do want to block it and screen that out. You want to start to understand your soil type. So here in this picture, the previous owners of this property looks like they're really into volleyball, so you need to understand that they have a lot of sand here. You need to understand that soil type throughout the property. Soil types can change from the backyard to the front yard, and that becomes critically important for plant selection. So understanding that soil type. You need to understand your drainage, where that water is going to go, where your downspouts are on your property. It looks like this picture here, we got a severe slope. So understanding those slopes and how to manage those slopes. So perhaps in this example, they may be inclined to put a retaining wall here, you know, cut a retaining wall in, take some of that dirt and backfill it on this side to, you know, level that out and make it a more usable landscape. So understanding the drainage, you want to keep that water going away from your property, keep it from going onto your neighbor's property. You need to understand that slope. Maybe you need to level some of that area out for more usable planting beds, more usable lawn area. So might have to include some retaining walls if you have some of these slopes. So understanding if you have a flat slope or if it's an extremely high slope, and what you're going to do with that high slope. If you're not going to level it out, what can you do for that high slope as far from a design standpoint? Do you need to do some erosion control? You need to understand where your existing irrigation is. Do you have an irrigation system? Do you need to install one all the way from scratch? Do you need to just kind of renovate that irrigation system? Do you have pop-up zones? Do you have a rotor zone? Do you have a drip zone? So you need to understand those components of the irrigation system as you start your design. Also included in having a plan is this understanding what you want your landscape to function as. So you need to understand the needs of your area. So this picture here, we have a wonderful family pet, family dog. So it might be really important to have a Kentucky bluegrass lawn for that dog, just because Kentucky bluegrass really does have that high tolerance of foot traffic and can stand up better to those pets and animals that are going to be out there. Or maybe you have children who like to play that pickup soccer game on Friday nights during the summer. So it might be important for you to have that Kentucky bluegrass lawn area, a reasonable sized, practical sized turf area in the backyard for those needs. Maybe you need to include some pathways to traverse around your property to get that mower into the backyard to go ahead and mow that lawn once a week. Maybe again, going back to the kids, maybe you need to include an area for the children to play in. And what should that be? Should it be mulch? Should it be gravel? Are you planning a place for them to have a trampoline or maybe a playhouse? So this just really starting to understand what you really want. And like I said, it's a really exciting time because you can really start, it's kind of a dreaming process, start to understand what you want. Maybe you want a patio, a large patio for entertaining and barbecues, or maybe your dream was to have a fire pit. So this is where you really start to put those things on a plan, inventory, all those things that you're really wanting. The next step is to draw your site plan to scale. So there's really a few approaches here that you can take. El Paso County Assessor's Office would be a good starting place to get your plot map of your property, and that should show the footprint of your house and your property boundaries. Pikes Peak Regional Building is another option. They might have a plot map or that footprint of your house. And if all else fails, you could potentially try a Google Earth image, satellite image from above. Sometimes those can work really well just to get your footprint of your house and get that property boundary, especially if you have some real definitive property boundaries. The only time that becomes very difficult is if you live in a mature neighborhood that has a lot of mature trees. It can be difficult to see those property boundaries. But what you want to do once you get those components set, as far as your footprint of your house and those property boundaries, is you really want to put that on paper to scale. So one technique is to use grid paper to put that to scale. And the other technique is to use a scale of your own. So a good scale is every 1 inch equals 10 feet, or if it's on a smaller size paper, maybe you need to do every 1 inch is equal to 20 feet. But the way you do that is you take a measurement of your house, of your footprint of your house. So maybe you might take a measurement from this corner to this corner, and if that's 40 feet, then you would make this line, if you're using a scale of 1 inch equals 20 feet, you would just make that a 2 inch line that would be drawing this house footprint to scale. So it's really important to draw this to scale because that's going to allow you to properly scale if you're doing a patio or a relaxation patio area, a fire pit area, to put those things at scale. But also, it's really important for when you're starting to put these plants on the plan to put those at scale as well. Make sure you're putting those plants to scale at the mature size. That way, you can really start to understand what your available planting areas. You don't want to overcrowd these plants. And again, you can really start to dial this plan in. But once you have that house footprint to scale, once you have your property boundary and your property site plan to scale, the next step is to do a bubble diagram. So this is really just a brainstorming activity where you're going to go ahead and start to just loosely put in some areas. Maybe this vegetable garden here in the top corner is it's the southwest portion of the yard, so that's receiving most sunlight. Maybe that's a desirable area for that vegetable garden. The shed over here, potentially you need to have that shed there because you've got a pretty sizable lawn area here. And it would make sense to have a shed there. That way you can go ahead and pull the mower directly out of that shed and start to do your lawn maintenance and your landscape maintenance from that shed. So really it's just a brainstorming activity. And what I really encourage you to do is go ahead and make multiple copies of that site plan that you've done to scale. That way you can really let those creative juices flow and go ahead and start making multiple plans, multiple brainstorming activities with these bubble diagrams. Following that, you're really going to start to define those areas. So if you from that bubble diagram, if you find one that you really like and you like the way it's looking, next step would be to start to define this area. So you can see here they've started to define this patio size and this patio shape. That's all to scale. They've even put in this window well just so they know that they have a window well here. They've started to put some of these plants in at scale. They've put this pathway in. They need to have a pathway here to get to this Kentucky bluegrass area. They've got a reasonable size, an appropriate size lawn surrounded by some perennial planting beds, it looks like. So that's really the next step. And here's another example of starting to define those areas. And this is really where it starts to really take shape once you start to define these areas at scale. That way you can understand the plants that you're going to need, understand the area that you really have. You can start to put these vegetable gardens in at scale, and that's really helpful for if this is a DIY project and you're going to build these raised vegetable gardens. Now you can understand the actual size of those vegetable gardens, going to get the proper size lumber to build those vegetable gardens. If you have it to scale and you're installing this turf, now you understand how much square feet of turf, approximate square feet of lawn or sod that you may need, number of plants, things of that nature. So this is really where it starts to take shape. The next principle is to evaluate and improve the soil. So we really highly recommend a professional soil test, and Colorado Springs Utilities has a soil preparation fact sheet. And on that soil preparation fact sheet, we have a little box over here that really will tell you the process to go ahead and get a professional soil test. It looks like they can cost anywhere around from $30 to $40, but it's highly recommended to get that professional soil test just because, like I said, some plants prefer a certain soil type over the other. And if you know that soil type, you can really set yourself up for best success. Also, understanding your soil type can be really important for irrigation practices. So then the question becomes to amend or not to amend. So that's really the question, and how do you amend? So for Kentucky bluegrass, it's always recommended to amend that soil. Kentucky bluegrass really prefers soils with a high organic matter content. Where native grasses, they prefer soils that are native to our area that are lower in organic matter content, so it's not recommended to amend those soils for the native grass. Perennial beds, sometimes, depending on the plants, and if you have native and very low water plants, it may not need to be amended. So understanding, going back to that plan, if you have that plan and you have those soil types, now you can really start to develop which areas you're going to amend and which areas you're not going to amend, because that way it prevents you from having to amend your entire property if you may not need to amend that area if you're doing native plants, or if it's a perennial bed that may not need that requirement for those amendments. And how do you amend? It's recommended to apply 1 to 2 inches of amendments on top of your soil, and then go ahead and till that into a depth of 6 inches. Or if you're purchasing this, it's the rate that you're going to want to purchase that at is 4 cubic yards for every 1,000 square feet. That will give you roughly that 2 inches of amendment on top of that soil before you go ahead and till that into that soil. The next principle is to create practical turf areas. So again, rather than it being from fence to fence or from the patio and the foundation all the way to the fence, that was a nice landscape in the 1990s, 2000s, but it became very expensive to maintain the water as the water needs of that landscape are extremely high. Rather than being fence to fence, we recommend to size these turf areas or these lawn areas down to a more practical size, and use that turf in the proper locations. So high traffic areas are really the best suited areas for Kentucky bluegrass, and generally that backyard is where you're that's gonna receive that most foot traffic. Because again, going back to that backyard, if you're entertaining or having barbecues or your children are playing in the backyard, that's generally where that grass is going to receive that foot traffic. One thing we like to say is if the only time that grass is receiving foot traffic is when you mow, then it's probably an indication that you probably don't need that area to be a high water usage Kentucky bluegrass, and it can be transitioned either to an alternative turf grass or a native grass like buffalo grass or blue grama, or it can be transitioned to a water-wise planting bed with water-wise plants. So again, think throw rug versus fence to fence. This image here, we're getting pretty close to a fence to fence. We got this nice patio on the right-hand side here, but we have this, nice little mulch bed with just the tree, not much plants in there. And again, we have another bed here with maybe some rocks, but no plants. This could easily be transitioned to a water-wise landscape by just creating that practical turf area, reducing that size of that lawn, bringing in that edging or that boundary of that lawn, and going ahead and adding some shrubs, perennials, some ornamental grasses on that perimeter, and then irrigating that separately from the lawn. That way it can be irrigated, and those water needs of those plants can be met easier. So this is another example. This is at our water-wise neighborhood at the demonstration garden at 2855 Mesa Road. This is our water-wise neighborhood, and this is the purple house. And what we're really doing here is demonstrating the fact that you still can have Kentucky bluegrass. In fact, it's really recommended for those high foot traffic or high traffic areas just because of that traffic tolerance of that species of grass. What we're demonstrating here is having that Kentucky bluegrass in the backyard area, and then moving towards the front yard, we have some, this nice garden wall going towards the front door. We have a nice planting bed with some mulch and some perennial plants. On the left-hand side of this entryway walkway, we have another beautiful perennial planting bed with some variegated iris, and then the front lawn has been transitioned to a buffalo grass. So that buffalo grass is less water intensive, less maintenance intensive, and since it's in the front lawn, it's really not receiving that foot traffic. So consider alternative grass species for those low to no traffic areas. So the next principle is to select well-adapted plants to our climates, and this is really the most exciting step of the planting design or the landscape design. But it's also really easy to steer away from your plan. So it's really important that you stick to that plan. Colorado Springs Utilities has a wonderful website, waterwiseplants.org. Over 400 plants on this website. You can create a favorites list and start to create those favorites that you really enjoy. So I'd recommend checking out waterwiseplants.org. It has water requirements, maintenance practices. If it's deer or animal resistant, it'll indicate that on this website. It's going to indicate the bloom time. So it's a really useful website. But one of the things that you really need to keep in mind is that USDA hardiness zone. And here's a little image of the USDA hardiness zones. And it's done by the average minimum temperature. So you really want to make sure that you're paying attention to make sure that those plants that you're purchasing or putting in your design are suited well for our climate. So I would say that we're probably in that 4, maybe pushing that 4A range, because this past winter, we had that cold snap. We got pretty close to that negative 30 degrees temperature. So you really want to make sure you're putting in plants that are well suited for our climate. You wouldn't want to be putting in a plant from zone 10A that down here in, closer to, Houston, Texas area, or, California, Florida. You really don't want to be putting them in those plants here in Colorado Springs just because of our extreme climate that we receive of getting down to that negative below 0 degree temperatures. Whereas those plants are not used to that. They're only used to the coldest they're used to, coldest temperature they're used to receiving is 35 degrees. So make sure you're paying attention to those. And on those plant ID cards at the nursery, they'll generally have that hardiness zone, how far that plant can survive and which zone it's best suited for. Make sure you're selecting plants that have the proper exposure. So again, going back to that plan, make sure you're selecting plants. If you have a yard that most of your yard receives full sun and your planting bed areas are going to be in full sun, don't select plants that are that prefer shade, part shade to shade, and put those in the full sun because they're not going to perform well. So make sure you're selecting plants based on those proper exposures. And again, at the nurseries and the plant ID cards, if you pull them up, if you're at the nursery and you pull them up, those are generally going to indicate those preferences of those plants. It's going to indicate the water requirements. It's going to indicate the sun exposure requirements. So make sure you're paying attention to those as you're designing your landscape from your plan. Make sure you understand the soil type preference of those plants. Some plants prefer a clay soil, some plants prefer a sandy soil. So depending on what soil types you have at your property, make sure you're selecting those plants accordingly. Make sure you have the water requirements, keeping in mind those water requirements. One component to a water-wise landscape is putting plants with like water requirements in the same area. That's called hydrozoning. So what that means is if you have an area that is receiving moderate water, so you have plants that receive moderate water, maybe 2 times a week, you don't want to put a plant that needs very low water with that moderate water planting bed. And vice versa, you don't want to have a very low or low water planting bed and then put in a plant that needs to have received moderate water, because that becomes a problem for plant health and also for irrigation scheduling. So make sure that you put these plants with like water need in the same area. That's called hydrozoning. Select these plants based on color, texture, and form. So selecting plants goes well beyond the flower color. It can have the foliage color or the leaf color. Maybe it's the texture. Maybe you have some evergreens with some spiky needle texture, or maybe it's a really nice compact mound forming plant that you want to for that form. Maybe it has a waxy leaf for that texture or a fuzzy leaf. So selecting those plants based on color, texture, and form is really important, and it goes beyond the flower color. Selecting plants based on bloom time. So maybe it's important for this planting bed to have, to be blooming multiple times throughout the growing season. Maybe you live in an area that you have a lot of deer traffic, so it's important to select those plants for that are known to be deer resistant or perform well in areas that have a lot of deer traffic. And then finally, selecting plants based on the maintenance requirements and your desired maintenance level. Some plants we call them a one-touch plant, so they need to be maintained 1 time a year, and that's generally in the spring. You can go ahead and, if it's a perennial, you can clean that perennial up, cut the dead back, and it grows throughout the growing season. Or if it's an ornamental grass, you cut it back 1 time in the spring, and it grows throughout the growing season. You don't have to continue to maintain that throughout the season. Some plants require deadheading, so pensimons. Those are a plant that's going to require more frequent maintenance, and that's going to require some deadheading. The next principle is to water efficiently. So it's highly encouraged to invest in an automatic sprinkler system. Those automatic sprinkler systems have a great deal of benefit, and I can start to name them off. They water much more efficiently into the targeted area. They can free your time. It provides an increase in your property value. So it's really important, and it's going to also increase the sustainability of that landscape and overall health of those plants. So investing in an automatic sprinkler system is definitely encouraged. The next step is to go ahead and schedule that irrigation system appropriately, proper scheduling. So one of the easiest ways is to water according to the season. And watering according to the season is simply, all you do is adjust your number of weekly watering days as we progress through the season. So in the springtime, we're still receiving cool temperatures. It's not necessary to water 3 days per week. And you can kind of see the curve here where we kind of, in the springtime, it's 1 day per week, May 2, and we ramp all the way up in the heat of the summer, June, July, and August. And then we're kind of come back down as we move into fall. So that's one of the easiest ways to schedule properly. Going back to your soil types on your property, if you understand that soil type, you might want to implement cycle and soak. In fact, using a cycle and soak scheduling technique is always encouraged. So how that works is if you, for example, if you have a lawn area and you're scheduled to irrigate that lawn area for 21 minutes, what you're going to do is take that 21 minutes up and divide it into 3. So now you have 7 minutes, but you're going to water for 7 minutes, wait for 30, water for 7, wait for 30, and then finally water for that final 7 minutes for a total of 21 minutes. But what that does is allow that water to percolate deeper into the soil. It allows those plant roots to drive deeper, and as those plant roots drive deeper and become a larger rooting zone, they become more drought tolerant and drought resistant. So they aren't going to show those signs of stress as easily in the heat of the summer. You want to make sure that you're applying the correct amount. And you want to make sure that you have the proper irrigation method matched with your plants that you have or your landscape. So again, going back to waterwiseplants.org, it's going to indicate to you what that water requirement is. And going back to your plan, you want to make sure you're putting those plants with like water needs in the same area, so that way it's easy to schedule that irrigation and water it efficiently. If you want to make sure that you're watering with the correct method, so turf or lawn areas, it's generally overhead or sprinklers that are going to be watering that area. So these images on the bottom here, these are generally found in a lawn or a turf area, because these are going to be throwing water into the air, irrigating that larger square footage of area. For fixed sprays, it generally takes 20 minutes to get a ½ inch of water down. So watering according to the season, if you're in the heat of the summer, watering a ½ inch each watering day is going to set your lawn up for best success, and it's going to allow those lawn roots to drive deeper and allow that lawn to go more days between watering as we move through the growing season. If it's a perennial bed, if it's a densely planted perennial bed, you may still consider maybe these multi-stream rotary nozzles that are irrigating that densely planted perennial bed. If you just have a kind of a sparsely planted, more simple approach to a planting bed, I would highly consider and I would recommend using a drip irrigation, whether it's a point source, so that's where you have water that's going directly to that plant, or maybe if it's a little more densely planted, you might consider an inline drip, which is a manufactured drip irrigation system piping that has drip emitters that are spaced evenly throughout that drip line. You might want to use drip irrigation, and it's highly encouraged to use drip irrigation for your vegetable garden as well. So pairing the proper irrigation method for your plant water needs for your plant is critically important. You should consider upgrading that equipment to a high efficient equipment. In fact, Colorado Springs Utilities offers rebates for most of these products. Colorado Springs Utilities offers a rebate for a smart irrigation controller that's WaterSense certified. Colorado Springs Utilities offers a rebate for these high efficiency match precipitation multi-stream rotary nozzles that we see in this picture. The benefit of this irrigation product is it applies water at a slower rate and larger water droplets that allow that water to percolate and soak deeper into that soil versus running off. The larger water droplets are also less susceptible to that wind drift. And for the most part in Colorado Springs, in our environment, we receive a steady amount of wind, so these can be a great benefit in our climate here. We also offer a rebate for heads with pressure regulation and check valves. So a head that has pressure regulation could be very important. If you observe your irrigation system when it turns on and there's a lot of fogging and misting, that's an indication of high pressure. So a simple way to address that is to get a head that has pressure regulation in it. That's going to go ahead and dial that pressure down and allow that head to operate more effectively and efficiently. The check valve, what that does is, if you have a yard that has a lot of elevation change, that check valve head is going to allow that water to remain in that irrigation line versus having gravity drain that out of the lowest head. So it's super efficient. We offer rebates on all of those products. Colorado Springs Utilities offers rebates on all of those products. Then finally, you want to maintain your irrigation system. I highly recommend to observe your irrigation running on a minimum of once per month. And if you can do it more frequently, that's even better. Because a lot of times irrigation is occurring during the early morning hours or late night hours when you're not able to observe that irrigation system running. And that can be a problem if you're missing a head, like in this picture here, we're missing a nozzle, or if you have a broken head, you may not notice that right away. That's going to drive up your water costs, and that's going to start to show stress in that landscape. Or if you have a drip system where you have a clogged emitter or a missing emitter and that drip system is leaking and not functioning properly, it's important to catch those as soon as possible and make those repairs in a timely manner. The next principle is to use mulch. So using mulch is critically important between the plants because that keeps that soil cool. It helps with moisture retention. And the biggest benefit is it reduces that weed growth. In order for it to reduce or suppress those weeds, you need to make sure that mulch is applied at the correct depth. There's really two different types of mulch. We have organic mulch, which you see in this picture, which is a bark or a wood chip or a humus mulch. So that's an organic mulch. Or you can have a rock mulch, which is considered inorganic. Generally, most rock mulches are 3/4 inch in size or smaller, and some plants actually prefer this rock mulch because those soils are generally more well drained for that plant, and that plant prefers a more well drained soil. But going back, you want to make sure that both of these mulch types are applied at the correct depth in order for them to serve their purpose and function properly. For organic mulches, for that wood mulch or that bark mulch, you want to make sure that's applied at a 3 to 4 inches of depth. And then for the inorganic rock mulch, you want to make sure that's applied at a depth of 2 inches. Then finally, we do not recommend the usage of weed barrier. Weed barrier can become very problematic for the fact that weed barrier sometimes is not water permeable, and the dirt and the sand and the soil that's being carried in the air, along with the weed seeds that are being carried through the wind drift, that over time will settle on top of that weed barrier or that weed fabric. And what happens is you have weeds that start to develop and grow and germinate on top of that weed fabric and grow through that weed fabric. And the next thing you know, when you're having to perform this maintenance, you're pulling that weed out, but you're also pulling up that weed barrier or that weed fabric. So it's not recommended to use weed barrier, and that's a huge benefit because it can save a cost in this landscape design and implementation phase. And then finally, the last principle is to maintain with good horticultural practices. So simple ways to do that really, really good spring cleanup. That's where you're going ahead and cutting back all those perennials, maintaining your yard. Once that lawn reaches that 4 inches, go ahead and give it that first cut for the season. Cutting back those ornamental grasses, pruning as needed. If you have a shrub that's starting to, or ornamental tree that's starting to invade on a pathway, go ahead and make sure you prune that back. Adding that mulch and replenishing that mulch throughout the season on an ongoing basis will really help with that weed suppression, that moisture retention, and the soil, keeping that soil cool. Ongoing weeding practices, make sure you're staying on top of the weeding for your landscape. And then finally, implementing really sound mowing practices. One rule to keep in mind for mowing is the 1/3 rule. And so that means you do not want to cut more than 1/3 of that height of that grass blade off at one time, because it can be damaging to that lawn. Make sure your mower blades are sharpened. Go ahead and rather than bagging that, if you're mowing at the proper time and you're not cutting off more than that 1/3, rather than bagging, just go ahead and mulch those grass clippings back into the lawn, because that can be a really good source of nutrients for the lawn moving forward. So maintaining with good horticultural practices on an ongoing basis is very important. And to conclude, you need to have a plan and stick to the plan. Again, it's an exciting time. It's easy to get steer off of that plan, but I can just tell you that you're going to have better success if you stick to that plan, especially when you're selecting plants. Make sure you're sticking to that plan for your selecting plants, because those are going to set those plants up for best success. You may consider implementing the design in a phased approach to keep from being overwhelmed. This can be an overwhelming process, so just keep in mind that you can do it in a phased approach. You need to start to determine what work is you're going to be able to take care of yourself or do yourself versus which work that you might need to hire out for professional work. Perhaps maybe you can install the landscape, but you would want a professional landscape designer to go ahead and design your landscape. So just start to think of those things as you are starting down this journey of a water-wise landscape design. Finally, you want to utilize plant databases. So waterwiseplants.org is an incredible resource that's available. Using local nurseries for plant selection can be super helpful. So utilizing those local resources available will help you set you up for best success for plant selection. Consider the water needs of your landscape throughout the design process. So again, going back to that 1/3 approach, or designing your landscape in thirds. So 1/3 of it can be that high water use area. Maybe it's that Kentucky bluegrass. The other third is a moderate water use or planting beds. And then finally, the other third is receives no water. So maybe it might be your patios or an unplanted area that's not going to be receiving any water. But that will set you up for success. And as you consider those water needs for your plants, just make sure you're considering the water needs throughout the design process. And then finally, all landscapes require some maintenance. So as you're designing this landscape, just keep in mind that all landscapes are going to require some maintenance ongoing. So with that, that's the conclusion of this webinar. I hope that this webinar will help you on your landscape journey and your landscape design journey and help you create a beautiful water-wise landscape design. Colorado Springs Utilities has some upcoming webinars that I highly encourage you to visit. Thank you so much.